Ethan Carter turned the valve and the whole thing blew. The rusted sprinkler head shot off like a bullet, and a jet of freezing water rocketed sideways straight over the fence, straight into his new neighbor's yard, and hit the woman there full in the chest before he could even shout a warning. She staggered. Boxes flew from her arms, and Ethan stood there wrench in hand, waiting for the scream. For 35 years he'd learned that mistakes cost you everything. But when she wiped the water from her eyes and looked at him, she wasn't angry at all. She was smiling. And what spilled out of those soaked boxes was about to change both their lives forever. Before we go on, drop the name of your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels tonight. And if a good story still means something to you, subscribe and stay with me to the end. The wrench slipped in Ethan Carter's hand, and he cursed under his breath quiet the way he'd trained himself to curse ever since Emma was old enough to repeat words. He'd been fighting this sprinkler line for 2 hours. The house was new to him, or new to them, him and Emma, but the plumbing was old, older than the divorce papers still sitting in a manila folder on his kitchen counter. Older maybe than his marriage had ever really been. He knelt in the wet grass of a backyard that wasn't quite his yet, in a neighborhood that didn't quite know him yet, in a state he'd moved to precisely because nobody there knew him at all. Colorado. Fresh start. That was the plan. That was always the plan. Just turn the main a quarter, he muttered to himself, gripping the corroded valve. Quarter turn, nice and easy. It was not nice. It was not easy. The valve gave all at once, decades of pressure behind it, and the old sprinkler head at the end of the line couldn't hold. It fired off the pipe with a metallic crack, and a rope of water thick as his arm came screaming out sideways, not up toward the sky where it belonged, but flat and hard across the low fence into the next yard over. No, 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 no! He lunged for the valve. Too late. In the half-second it took him to shut it back down, the water had already found its target. And its target was a person. Ethan looked up just in time to see a woman take the full force of it. She'd stepped out of her back door at exactly the wrong moment. Arms loaded with cardboard boxes, and the jet caught her across the shoulder and neck and drove her back a full step. The boxes went up in the air. She made a sound, half a gasp, half a shriek, and then the water was gone, shut off, and there was only the drip, drip, drip of a ruined morning. Ethan was already moving, vaulting the low fence wrench forgotten in the grass behind him. Ma'am, I am so sorry, I am so sorry. He got the whole apology out before he even reached her, the way you throw your hands up before a punch lands. Because he knew this part. He knew this cold. You made a mistake, and then you braced for what came after, because what came after was always worse than the mistake itself. 12 years of marriage had drilled that into his bones. You spilled the coffee, and then you paid for the coffee for a week. The woman stood there dripping. Her dark hair was plastered flat against her face. Her sweater was soaked through and clinging. He registered it in the back of his mind, the way you register weather. A bigger woman, solid and full-figured, and the wet clothes hid nothing. And he saw her arms come up on instinct, the old flinch of a body that had learned to be looked at wrong. He waited for the anger. Ma'am, I will pay for anything that got ruined. I will replace the boxes. I don't even know what to say. I just moved in. I was trying to fix the... Well. She wiped a sheet of water off her face with one hand and looked at him, and her eyes were bright and a little stunned and impossibly warm. That's certainly an interesting way to introduce yourself. Ethan stopped talking. Is spraying your neighbors your secret flirting technique? She said. Because I gotta tell you, buddy, it needs work. For a second, his brain simply refused the information. He'd braced so hard for the storm that when the sun came out instead, he didn't know what to do with his face. And then something happened that hadn't happened in a very long time. Ethan Carter laughed. It came out rough, unused, like a door that hadn't been opened in months. It surprised him more than it surprised her. He put a hand over his mouth like he could push it back in, and it didn't work, and he laughed harder. There it is, she said, and now she was grinning too, water still running off the end of her nose. I was starting to worry you were going to have a stroke over there. You went about 6 shades of white. I thought you were going to... He shook his head. I don't know what I thought. Yell at you. Something like that. Honey, it's water. She wrung out the hem of her sweater, and the water pattered onto the grass between them. "I've survived worse than water. Trust me. Honey." It landed soft and easy the way some people just talk, and Ethan felt the strangest loosening in his chest, some knot he hadn't known was there. "Ethan," he said, sticking out his hand, and then realizing it was wet, and pulling it back and wiping it on his jeans, and offering it again. "Ethan Carter, I just moved in. Obviously. Me and my daughter. Olivia Brooks." She took his hand. Her grip was firm and warm, even soaking wet. "Welcome to the neighborhood, Ethan Carter. You really know how to make an entrance." He helped her pick up the boxes. That was how it started. Not with anything you could point to, just a man on his knees in wet grass, gathering up soggy cardboard, because it was the decent thing to do, and because he still felt like garbage about the whole thing. "You don't have to," Olivia said, crouching beside him, but she didn't stop him either. "I sprayed them. I'll get them." Fair enough. The first box had held kitchen towels, and those were fine, just wet. The second had old picture frames, and one of the glass panes had cracked, and Ethan's stomach dropped all over again, until he saw it was a hairline crack. Nothing lost. He held the frame up a much younger Olivia, in a paper hat, standing in front of a storefront, with a hand-painted sign beaming like the world was hers. "That's you," he said. "That's me. Opening day." She took the frame gently from his hands and looked at it, and something moved behind her eyes that Ethan couldn't read yet. Long time ago. The third box was the one that mattered. It had come apart at the bottom when it hit the ground, and its contents had slid out across the grass, and Ethan reached for them before he really looked at what they were. Papers, mostly. A stack of photographs held together with a rubber band, now spotted with water. And loose sheets, official ones, the kind with letterhead across the top and dense small print underneath. I wasn't trying to read them. He wanted to be clear about that later to himself, that he had not been trying to read them. But you couldn't help catching the big words, the ones printed in bold, the ones designed to be caught. Final notice. Intent to terminate lease. Outstanding balance. And underneath in smaller type a name he'd just learned. Ms. Olivia Brooks. Brooks Family Bakery. Olivia's hand came down over the pages before he could see more. Quick. Not fast enough to be rude, but fast enough that they both knew exactly what had happened. "I got those," she said. Her voice was lighter than her hand. "Sure." Ethan let go. "Sure, sorry." She gathered the wet papers into a messy stack and pressed them against her chest over the soaked sweater, and for just a moment, the brightness went out of her like a cloud crossing the sun. She was looking down at the grass, at the water beating on the blades, and Ethan saw he couldn't have said how, that the joke about flirting and the honey and the easy warmth was all real, but it was also a coat she wore over something that wasn't warm at all. "It's not a big deal," she said to the grass. Ethan Carter had spent 12 years married to a woman who said, "It's not a big deal," when it was the biggest deal in the world. He knew the sound of it the way a sailor knows a change in the wind. "Okay," he said quietly, because sometimes okay is the kindest thing you can say. "Okay." That night, after Emma was asleep, Ethan stood in his half-unpacked kitchen and couldn't stop thinking about the words on those pages. Final notice. He knew what final notice felt like. He'd gotten his own kind of final notice 8 months ago across a lawyer's conference table from a woman he'd once promised his whole life to. Emma was 8. She'd taken the divorce the way kids take these things, quietly, and then all at once at the worst possible moments, at bedtime in the cereal aisle in the back seat, when she thought he couldn't hear her whispering to her stuffed rabbit. He'd moved them out of the city and across the state to give her something steady. A house with a yard. A neighborhood where the same kids walked to the same school every morning. A place where her father wasn't the guy people whispered about after the split. He hadn't come here for anything else. He'd told himself that 100 times. He was 35 and tired down to the marrow, and the last thing on earth he wanted was to feel something for anybody. And yet he stood at his kitchen window, looking at the soft light in the house next door, thinking about a woman who took a fire hose to the chest and laughed about it, and who then went quiet and small over a stack of papers, and he thought, "I know that. I know exactly what that is." I didn't sleep much. The next morning, There was a knock at his door, and when he opened it, Olivia Brooks was standing on his porch, holding a foil-covered plate dry now, and dressed in a sunflower yellow cardigan, and looking a great deal more composed than she had the day before. "Peace offering," she said, holding out the plate. "For the trauma of thinking you'd murdered your neighbor on day one. You brought me a peace offering, I sprayed you." "Yeah, well," she shrugged. "I bake. It's what I do. Cinnamon rolls. They're better warm, so don't let them sit." Behind Ethan, a small voice said, "Are those for us?" Emma had appeared at his hip, the way kids do, silent as a cat, still in her pajamas, with her hair. A bird's nest, staring at the foil plate, like it was the answer to a prayer she hadn't known she was praying. Olivia's whole face changed. Ethan watched it happen. Whatever she'd been carrying, whatever those papers meant, it all got set down somewhere, the moment she looked at his daughter, and what replaced it was so genuine it made his throat tight. "You must be Emma," Olivia said, crouching down to be eye level with her knees popping, ignoring it. "Your dad told me about you. He said you're the smartest person in this whole house, which, no offense to your dad, is probably not a very high bar." Emma giggled. Actually giggled. Ethan couldn't remember the last time. "He fixes things," Emma offered. "But he broke the sprinkler." "I know," Olivia said in a delighted stage whisper. "He got me soaked, right in the face. I looked like a drowned raccoon." Emma dissolved into laughter, and Ethan stood in his own doorway, feeling like a man watching sunlight come into a room he'd thought was permanently dark. "These are the best cinnamon rolls in the whole world," Emma announced 10 minutes later, mouth full frosting on her chin at the kitchen table she and her dad had only sat at 3 times. "She made them," Ethan said. "You made these?" Emma's eyes were enormous. "By yourself, in your kitchen?" "In my bakery, actually," Olivia said. "I have a whole shop. Well, a tiny flicker there and gone. For now I do." Ethan caught it. Emma didn't. A whole shop of these. Emma looked like she'd been told about a place where money grew on trees. "Can we go? Dad, can we go?" "Emma." "You are welcome any time," Olivia said warmly. "Both of you. First one's on the house. Family discount for the man who tried to drown me." She stayed 40 minutes. Ethan hadn't offered coffee to a single soul since he'd moved in, and now here was a woman at his table drinking it. Black telling his daughter about a stray cat that lived behind her bakery and stole croissants right off the cooling rack, and Emma was laughing so hard she got the hiccups and something in the house. Ethan felt it, physically felt it, the way you feel. A fever breaks something in the house, came back to life. Over the next few weeks, the fence between them stopped being a fence. Ethan fixed things. It was what he did, and Olivia's house was old and full of small betrayals, a leaking faucet, a sticking door, a porch step that wobbled and would eventually put somebody in the hospital. He fixed them one by one, waving off her protests because it was the only currency he had, and because, if he was honest, being over there was better than being alone in his own quiet house at night. Olivia fed them. That was her currency. She showed up with bread and soup, and once an entire lasagna that fed the 2 of them for 3 days. She learned that Emma didn't like onions and started leaving them out. She learned that Ethan drank his coffee black, and that he got a certain look on his face on Sunday nights the night before Emma's every other weekend went back to normal, and she stopped asking about that look after the first time she saw it close down his whole face. "You don't have to tell me," she said once, standing in his kitchen drying a dish he'd washed. "But if you ever want to, I'm right through that fence." Ethan didn't tell her, not then, but he remembered that she'd offered. Emma latched onto Olivia the way a plant leans toward a window. It scared Ethan a little how fast and how hard. Emma started asking on Tuesdays if they could see Miss Olivia. She drew her a picture Olivia in her paper hat, a cat in the corner, a sun with a smile, and Olivia hung it in the bakery window where everyone could see it, and Emma talked about that for a week. "She's not going anywhere, is she?" Emma asked one night out of nowhere at bedtime. Ethan stopped with his hand on the light switch. "Why would you ask that?" "I don't know." Emma pulled her rabbit up under her chin. "People go places sometimes." People go places sometimes. 8 years old, and she'd already learned it. Ethan sat down on the edge of the bed. Miss Olivia lives right next door, Bug. She's not going anywhere. But he thought about the papers. Final notice. Intent to terminate. And he realized he'd made his daughter a promise he had absolutely no way of keeping. So, he learned the truth in pieces. The way you learn anything true about a person who spent a lifetime learning to hide it. He learned that the bakery had been open 11 years. That Olivia had opened it at 20, with money she'd saved working 2 jobs and a small loan from a grandmother who'd since passed. That the storefront in the photograph, the one from opening day, was the same one she stood in now, and that she'd painted the sign herself. He learned that 18 months ago, a commercial bakery had opened out by the highway, a chain gleaming with a drive-through and prices Olivia couldn't touch, and muffins that cost less than the flour Olivia put in hers. He learned that her regulars had drifted one by one, not because they didn't love her, but because a dollar is a dollar, and times were tight for everybody. He learned all this the hard way on a Thursday, when he came over to fix the wobbling porch step and found Olivia sitting at her kitchen table with a calculator and a stack of bills, and her head in her hands, and she didn't hear him knock, and he stood in the doorway watching a woman he was starting to care about very much cry as quietly as his ex-wife used to. And he understood that some people learn to cry without making any noise at all, because at some point in their lives, it wasn't safe to be heard. Olivia. She jerked upright, wiped her face fast and hard with the heel of her hand, and pasted the coat back on, before she even turned around. Ethan, hey. I didn't hear you. The step right, come in. Sorry, I'm a mess in here. Olivia. It's just paperwork. You know how it is, boring grown-up stuff. Olivia. She stopped. And for a second the two of them just looked at each other across the kitchen, and Ethan didn't say anything clever, because he didn't have anything clever, he only had the truth. You don't have to do the thing, he said. The thing where you're fine, not with me. I've done that thing for 12 years. I'm real good at it, and I'm telling you it doesn't work. It just makes you tired. Her face crumpled. She fought it. She lost. I'm going to lose it, she said, and her voice broke clean in half. I'm going to lose the bakery, everything I built. 11 years, Ethan. I've got maybe 2 months. I've done the math 40 times and it comes out the same every time, and I don't... She pressed her hand over her mouth. I don't know how to tell people. I don't know how to walk in there and tell my regulars that after 11 years I failed. I couldn't hold it together. That's what they'll think. That's what everybody always thinks about me anyway. What does everybody think about you? Come on. No, say it. What does everybody think? Olivia looked at him, and there was something desperate and defiant in it, a wound she was about to press on herself just to prove it hurt. That I'm the fat lady who bakes, she said flatly. That's it. That's the whole story to most people. They take one look and they've already decided everything. That I don't have discipline, that I let myself go. That whatever happened to me, I probably brought it on myself because that's how people are. Ethan, they look at a body like mine, and they think they already know the whole person inside it. Her chin was trembling. I spent my whole life being everybody's second choice. Their backup, their good friend, the one who brings the food and remembers the birthdays and never ever gets chosen. And I made peace with it. I did. I built this whole life where I didn't need to be chosen because I had the bakery. I had this one thing that was mine, that I made that people needed, and now I'm going to lose that too. The kitchen was very quiet. Ethan crossed it slowly and sat down across from her at the table, moving the calculator and the bills gently to one side, and he looked at her the way he would realize later nobody had looked at her in a very long time. Not with pity. Not with the careful sliding away eyes people used. He looked at her like she was the most obviously valuable thing in the room, and he couldn't understand why she didn't know it. You want to know what I see, he said. Ethan, you made my daughter laugh, he said. First week. You made her laugh out loud in a house that hadn't had a laugh in it in months, and you didn't even try, you just did it. You leave the onions out of her soup because you noticed once that she pushed them to the side. You hung her ugly little drawing in your window like it was a Rembrandt. His own voice wasn't steady now. You took a fire hose to the chest from a total stranger and you made a joke so he would feel better. You. soaking wet, standing there worried about me. That's who I see. I don't see a body. Olivia, I see the hardest working, kindest person I've met in years, and I've been trying to figure out for weeks why on God's green earth you talk about yourself like you're something people have to put up with. Olivia stared at him. Tears ran straight down her face, and she didn't wipe them this time. She just let him see them. "You're going to make me cry harder," she whispered. "Cry as hard as you want," Ethan said. "I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." And he wasn't. That was the thing he understood, sitting at that scarred kitchen table, with the calculator pushed to one side. He wasn't going anywhere. Somewhere in the last few weeks without deciding to, without wanting to, without any intention of ever letting it happen again after the wreckage of his marriage, Ethan Carter had started to fall. But falling, it turned out, was the easy part. Because the truth was, Ethan had his own final notice coming. He just didn't know it yet that Thursday afternoon. He found out 3 days later on the phone, standing in his own kitchen, when his ex-wife's voice came down the line, as smooth and cold as the granite countertop under his free hand. "I've been thinking, Ethan," she said, "about Emma." He knew that tone. 12 years he knew that tone, the way you know the smell of smoke. What about her? "I don't think Colorado's working. For her. I think she needs stability. Real stability. 2 parents in the same city. A school she doesn't have to keep switching. And I've talked to a lawyer, and honestly, given everything, given that you're doing all this alone on a repairman's income, in a house you're still fixing up." "Don't," Ethan said. "I think it might be best for her to come back and live with me. During the school year, you could have her summers." The floor of Ethan's stomach dropped out the way it had when the sprinkler blew that same sideways lurch of watching something go wrong faster than he could stop it. "You are not taking my daughter. Our daughter. And I'm not taking anyone, Ethan. I'm thinking about what's best for her. Can you honestly tell me that a little girl is better off in a half-unpacked house with a father who works 10-hour days than with her mother? Really? You want to sit there and tell me you're giving her the perfect life? Perfect." There was that word again. It came out of everybody's mouth eventually, and it was always aimed straight at the softest part of him, because it was the one thing he could never give, and everybody seemed to know it. "I have to go," Ethan said, because his voice was about to break, and he would rather have died than let her hear it. He hung up. He put both hands flat on the counter. He stood there for a long time in the quiet house he'd bought to save his daughter, listening to the refrigerator hum. And for the first time in months, the old familiar voice came back, the one he'd moved 1,000 miles to get away from, and it said what it always said. "You're failing. You're failing everyone. You always have." Through the window, the light was on in Olivia's kitchen. I didn't go over. He couldn't. She had 2 months to save the only thing she had, and the last thing she needed was to carry his troubles too. So he stood alone in the dark and carried it himself, the way he'd been carrying everything himself for as long as he could remember. And he thought, this is why you don't let people in. This is exactly why. What? Ethan didn't know. What he couldn't have known, standing alone at his window that night, was that 30 feet away, on the other side of a fence, he'd sprayed a woman over Olivia Brooks, was standing at her own window, looking at his light, and thinking almost exactly the same thing. She was thinking about the way he'd looked at her across the kitchen table. The hardest working, kindest person I've met in years. She'd turned that sentence over in her hands 100 times since, like a stone she couldn't put down. And she was thinking, he has a daughter. He has a life to rebuild. He deserves someone who isn't drowning, someone younger, someone easier, someone he doesn't have to save. Olivia Brooks had spent 30 years being everyone's second choice, and she had learned exactly one way to protect the softest part of herself. Leave before you can be left. Pull back before the other shoe drops. Be the one who decides, so you're never the one who's decided about. And she was starting to make a decision. She looked at the for sale number she'd scrawled on a sticky note that afternoon. A realtor's gotten in a moment of quiet panic. She looked at the light in Ethan's window. She thought about Emma's laugh and Ethan's rough, rusty, out-of-practice one, and about how badly, how dangerously she'd started to want to be part of that house, that family, that life. And that want scared her more than losing the bakery did. Because the bakery she knew how to lose. She'd been bracing for that for 18 months. But this a good man and a little girl and a table, she was always welcome at this, she did not know how to lose. And so the way she always had, she started figuring out how to leave it before it could be taken from her. She peeled the sticky note off the counter and stuck it to the fridge where she'd see it every morning, across the yard. Ethan turned off his kitchen light and went upstairs to check on his sleeping daughter, and stood in her doorway a long time, and made himself a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. 2 houses, 1 fence. 2 people who'd finally found somebody who saw them each lying awake that night alone. Both of them absolutely certain that the kindest thing they could do for the other was to let them go. And neither one of them had any idea that the whole neighborhood was already watching. That the elderly couple on the corner, and the young mother down the street, and a quiet man Olivia had once fed for free years ago when his whole world was falling apart. That all of them were about to remember at the exact same time everything Olivia Brooks had ever done for them. And that the very thing she'd built her armor to survive being seen, truly seen all the way down, was about to happen to her, whether she was ready for it or not. The sprinkler still sat broken in Ethan's yard. Neither of them slept. The morning Olivia decided to run, she almost got away with it. She was up before the sun, which wasn't unusual, but this time she wasn't going to the bakery. She was standing in her kitchen, in her robe phone in hand, thumb hovering over the realtor's number stuck to the fridge, and she'd rehearsed the words in her head all night. I'd like to list my house, as soon as possible. Quiet sale. I don't want a sign in the yard. Simple. Clean. The kind of decision you make fast before the part of you that wants to stay can talk you out of it. She pressed the button. It rang once, and then a small fist knocked on her back door. Olivia froze. It was 6:40 in the morning. Nobody knocked on her back door at 6:40 in the morning. She hung up before the second ring before anyone could answer, and stood there with her heart going like a rabbit's, and the knock came again, patient and light. She opened the door. Emma stood on the step in her school clothes backpack on both shoulders, hair actually brushed for once, holding a folded piece of paper in both hands, like it was something breakable. Emma, honey, does your dad know you're over here? He's in the shower. I have to be fast. Emma held up the paper. I made you something, in case. In case of what? In case you go places. Emma said it simply the way kids say the things that stop your heart. You said you weren't, but you had that face. Olivia crouched down. Her knees didn't want to, but she made them. What face, baby? The going places face. My mom had it before she went places. Emma pushed the paper into Olivia's hands. So I made you a reason to stay. You don't have to open it now. But don't throw it away, okay, even if you're mad. And then she turned and ran back across the 2 yards backpack, bouncing before Olivia could say a single word, and disappeared through her own back door, just as through the window, her father's silhouette came down the stairs. Olivia knelt on her own back step in the gray morning light and unfolded the paper with shaking hands. It was a drawing. 3 stick figures holding hands. A tall one, a small one, and a round one in the middle, with a paper hat. Above them, in careful 8-year-old letters that she'd clearly practiced, my family. And at the bottom, smaller or like an afterthought, that was really the whole point. Please stay, Miss Olivia. We picked you. We picked you. Olivia sat down right there on the cold concrete step and cried harder than she'd cried over any final notice, any bill, any calculator that came out the same 40 times. Because she had spent 30 years being nobody's first choice. 30 years being the backup and the good friend, and the one who brought the food, and a child had just crossed 2 yards at 6:40 in the morning to tell her in crayon that she'd been picked. The realtor's number was still on the fridge, but Olivia didn't call it that morning. She folded the drawing very carefully and put it in the pocket over her heart, and she went to the bakery, and she opened up like she did every day, and she told herself it didn't change anything. It changed everything. She just didn't know it yet. What she also didn't know was that at that exact moment, 4 blocks away, a man named Frank Delaney was standing in front of that gleaming highway bakery with a paper cup of their coffee going cold in his hand, and he was thinking about Olivia Brooks for the first time in 9 years. Frank was 62 now. He'd done well for himself, better than well. He owned 3 car dealerships across 2 counties, and he drove a truck that cost more than most people's houses, and he had a corner office with his name on the door. But 9 years ago, Frank Delaney had been a different man. 9 years ago, Frank had lost his wife to cancer and his savings to her medical bills in the same terrible 18 months, and he'd been so far underwater that he stopped answering his phone, and his daughter Katie, 12, then wrecked with grief, had stopped eating. And a young woman at a little bakery, a woman he barely knew, had noticed. He'd never told anyone the whole of it. How Olivia had started leaving a box on his porch. Bread first. Then whole meals wrapped and labeled with heating instructions in her round handwriting. How when he'd tried to pay her, she'd looked at him and said, "You'll pay it forward when you're back on your feet, Frank, and not one day before." How she'd taught Katie to decorate cookies on Saturday mornings for a whole winter, no charge, just so the girl had a reason to leave the house, and how Katie, who was now a pediatric nurse, who was now fine, who was now everything a father could pray for, had learned to smile again over a piping bag of pink frosting in the back of Olivia Brooks's bakery. Frank hadn't been back to that neighborhood in years. Life moved him. Uptown, moved him into the corner office, moved him into a version of himself that got his coffee from a drive-thru by the highway without thinking twice. But this morning, he'd overheard 2 women in line ahead of him talking, and one of them had said, "Did you hear about Brooks Bakery? Poor thing's closing. Couldn't compete. Such a shame, she was always so sweet." And the words had gone into Frank Delaney like a hook, and he'd walked out to the parking lot with his cold coffee and stood there for 10 minutes with a debt 9 years unpaid, burning a hole straight through his chest. He got in his truck. He didn't go to the office. He drove to the old neighborhood instead. Meanwhile, Ethan was having the worst week of his life since the divorce, and doing what he always did with the worst weeks, which was to say absolutely nothing to anyone. His lawyer had called back. The news was not good, and it was not simple, and it lived in that gray country where nothing's decided, but everything's threatened. His ex-wife had standing. The court would weigh stability. His income, his hours, the half-unpacked house, the fact that he was alone, every single thing Ethan had been quietly terrified about was now written down in a legal document with his daughter's name at the top, and the lawyer's careful voice kept using words like challenging and uphill, and "we'll do our best." And Ethan had hung up and sat in his truck in the parking lot of a hardware store and put his forehead on the steering wheel and not moved for a long time. He didn't tell Olivia. He told himself it was to protect her because she had her own mountain to climb, but that wasn't the whole truth, and some quiet part of him knew it. The whole truth was that Ethan Carter had learned over 12 years that the moment you let someone see how scared you were, you handed them the map to exactly where you were weakest. So he kept the map. He always kept the map. But Emma noticed. Emma always noticed. "You have the face too now," she told him at dinner, pushing a piece of chicken around her plate. "What face bug?" "The going places face. But you're not going anywhere, so I don't get it." Ethan set down his fork. "Where'd you learn about the going places face?" "Mom." Emma didn't look up. "Before she went places." And then, in the same flat little voice, "Is it me? Did I do something?" And Ethan's heart broke clean in half right there at the kitchen table, because his 8-year-old daughter had spent her whole short life learning to read the weather on the faces of the adults who were supposed to keep her safe, and she'd learned the worst lesson a child can learn, which is that when the grown-ups get quiet, it's probably your fault. "No," Ethan said, and he got up and came around the table and knelt down and took her face in both his hands. "No. Listen to me, Emma. It is never ever you. Whatever face I've got, it is grown-up stuff, and it is not about you, and I am not going anywhere, and neither are you. You hear me? You and me. We're a team." "And Miss Olivia," Emma said. Ethan hesitated for just a half a second, just long enough. Emma pulled back and looked at him with those enormous ancient eyes. "You didn't say her. When you said the team, you said you and me, and you didn't say her." "Emma." "She has the going places face too," Emma whispered. "I saw it, so I already gave her the picture." Ethan felt something cold walk up his spine. "What picture?" But Emma had gone quiet and stubborn the way she did, and she wouldn't say, And Ethan carried a brand new fear up to bed with him that night. The fear that his daughter had seen something in Olivia that he'd been trying very hard not to see himself. Because he had seen it too. He'd seen it 3 days ago when he'd waved to Olivia across the yard and she'd waved back, but not come over when she'd started answering his texts a little slower, a little shorter. When the woman who used to knock with a plate of something warm had gone 2 whole days without knocking at all. He'd told himself she was busy. She was drowning in the bakery. Of course she was pulling back. But Ethan Carter had watched a marriage die by inches, and he knew the difference between a person who was busy and a person who was leaving. He just didn't know why, and the not knowing was eating him alive. He found out the next afternoon, and he found out by accident, which was maybe the only way he ever could have. He'd gone over to return a casserole dish, and Olivia's back door was open, and he'd knocked and gotten no answer, and stepped just inside to leave the dish on the counter. And that's when he saw it. Stuck to the refrigerator right at eye level on a yellow sticky note in Olivia's round handwriting. A name, a phone number, and underneath it, underlined twice the word, Realtor. He stood there holding an empty casserole dish and felt the floor tilt. Ethan. She was in the doorway behind him, keys still in her hand. Home early from the shop, and she saw where he was looking, and he watched the color drain out of her face. "You're selling the house," he said. "Ethan, I can explain. You're selling the house and you didn't tell me." His voice didn't sound like his own. "How long?" "It's not. I haven't even listed it. I just got the number. It's not." "How long, Olivia? How long have you been planning to leave?" And there it was, out in the open, the word that had been living under everything for weeks. Leave. It landed in the kitchen like something dropped from a height, and they both flinched from it. Olivia set her keys down very carefully on the counter, the way you set something down when your hands aren't steady. "I think you should sit down." "I don't want to sit down. I want you to tell me the truth, for once. Both of us have been walking around this thing for weeks, and I am so tired, Olivia. I am so tired of everybody I love deciding things about my life without telling me." He stopped. Because he'd said it. Everybody I love. It had come out sideways in anger, the way the truest things always come out. And now it was in the room with them, and neither of them could pretend it wasn't. Olivia's eyes filled. "Don't," she whispered. "Please don't say that." "Why not?" "Because you don't mean it the way it sounds. And if you say it, I'm going to believe you, and I can't afford to believe you, Ethan. I can't." The words were coming faster now, tumbling a dam giving way. "Look at me. Look at my life. I'm losing the bakery. I've got 2 months before I lose the one thing I ever built. I'm 30 years old, and I've got nothing. I'm going to have to start completely over. And you have a daughter. You have a whole life. You're trying to put back together, and you deserve God. Ethan, you deserve somebody who can help you carry it, not somebody drowning right next to you. You deserve somebody younger. Somebody who isn't a mess. Somebody easier. Stop it. Somebody thinner. Stop it." And he said it so sharply that she actually did. He put the casserole dish down on the counter hard and crossed the kitchen, and he didn't touch her, but he got close enough that she couldn't look anywhere but at him. "Is that what this is? You're leaving me before I can leave you. You're running out on a good thing because you've already decided how it ends." "It always ends the same way," Olivia said, and her voice was very small and very sure, the voice of a decision made a long time ago. "For me, it always ends the same way. I'm the person people are grateful for, Ethan. I'm not the person people keep. I learned that a long time ago, and I made peace with it, and then you and Emma came along and unmade it. You made me start hoping again, and hoping is the most dangerous thing in the world for a person like me. So yes. Yes. I got the number. Because I would rather leave on my own 2 feet than stand here and watch you slowly realize you settled." The word hung there. Settled. Ethan was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke his voice had changed completely. All the anger had gone out of it, and what was left was something rawer and more frightened than anger. "My wife left me," he said, "because I wasn't enough. That's the whole story, Olivia. Strip it all down, that's what it is. I worked too much, I made too little, I couldn't give her the life she wanted, I wasn't enough. And she found somebody who was, and she left, and she took a piece of my daughter's whole idea of the world with her when she went." He swallowed. "And now she's trying to take Emma too. She called last week. She wants Emma back during the school year. She says I can't give her a good enough life out here. Alone. On a repairman's income. In a house I'm still fixing up." His eyes were wet now, and he let them be. "So don't you stand there and tell me you're not enough. Don't you dare. Because I have spent every day of the last 8 months being told I'm not enough by a court and a lawyer and a woman who used to love me, and the only place I have felt like enough since I moved to this state is at your kitchen table. So when you tell me you're going to run, what I hear is that the one good thing I found is walking out the door for my own good, and I've had about all of that I can take." Olivia stared at him. The tears were running freely down both their faces now, two grown adults standing in a kitchen with an empty casserole dish between them. Both of them stripped all the way down to the thing they were most afraid of. "She wants to take Emma," Olivia whispered. "Yeah. Because you're alone. Because I'm alone." And something moved across Olivia Brooks's face. Then something that started as heartbreak and turned slowly into something harder and hotter and far more dangerous. Because Olivia had spent her whole life being underestimated, being overlooked, being told what she was and wasn't good enough for, and she could take that. She'd built a whole life that could take that. But she had just watched a good man tell her that someone was trying to take his little girl away because he didn't have enough of the right kind of life. And she had watched that same little girl cross 2 yards at 6:40 in the morning to hand her a crayon drawing that said, "We picked you." And something in Olivia Brooks, some long-buried thing that had been beaten quiet for 30 years, stood up. "No," she said. Ethan blinked. "No what?" "No, she doesn't get to take Emma." Olivia wiped her face with the back of her hand, one hard swipe, and when she lowered it, the woman standing there was not the woman who'd been reaching for the realtor's number that morning. "She doesn't get to look at you and decide you're not enough for your own child because you don't have a wife in the house. That's Ethan, that's not even a real thing. That's just the same garbage people have been telling me my whole life, dressed up in a lawyer's suit." Somebody looks at a life from the outside, and they decide they already know the whole story. "Olivia, how many hours do you work?" "What? How many hours? A week?" "I don't 50-60. And you still do Emma's hair in the morning badly. I've seen it. It looks like a bird slept in it, but you do it. And you learned she doesn't like onions. And you moved 1,000 miles and bought a house with a yard so she'd have someplace steady. And you leave work early on the days she has a doctor's appointment. I've seen your truck. You think a court can't see all that. You think the only thing that makes a parent enough is a ring and a second income." Olivia's voice was rising, and it wasn't shaking anymore. "You listen to me. You are the best father I have ever seen in my life, and I have seen a lot of families come through my shop over 11 years. I know what a good one looks like. And no highway bakery corner office perfect on paper anything is going to convince me otherwise, and it is not going to convince a judge either, not if you fight." Ethan was looking at her like he'd never seen her before. "You'd help me fight." And there it was. The question underneath the question. The one that undid her. Because to help him fight, she'd have to stay. And to stay, she'd have to peel the realtor's number off the fridge and stop running and let herself be seen all the way down by a man who might still someday realize he'd settled and risk the one thing she'd spent 30 years making sure she'd never have to survive. Olivia looked at the sticky note on the refrigerator. She looked at Ethan. She thought about a crayon drawing in the pocket over her heart. "I don't know how to stay," she said quietly, and it was the most honest thing she'd ever said to anyone. "Ethan, I mean it. I don't know how. Every time something good gets close, I leave first. It's the only way I've ever known how to keep from getting—" She stopped. "I don't know how to let myself be picked, even by a little girl in crayon." Ethan crossed the last of the distance between them then. He reached up and took the sticky note off the fridge, slowly giving her every chance to stop him, and when she didn't, he crumpled it in his fist. "Then let me teach you," he said. "The same way you taught Emma that soup could have no onions. The same way you taught Frank Delaney's little girl that Saturdays could be okay again." Olivia's whole body went still. "How do you know about Frank Delaney?" Ethan frowned. "I don't. Who's Frank Delaney?" And that's when the knock came at the front door. Not the back door. The front. 3 firm knocks, the knock of a man who was used to walking into rooms and having them turn to look at him. Olivia and Ethan both startled, and Olivia wiped her face fast, that old reflex, and went to answer it, and Ethan followed her into the front hall, and when she opened the door, there was a big man in his 60s, standing on her porch, in an expensive coat, with a face that was fighting hard not to come apart. "Olivia Brooks," the man said. "Frank." Olivia's hand flew to her mouth. "Frank Delaney. My God, it's been 9 years, Frank said. His voice was rough. 9 years, Olivia, and I heard this morning in line at that highway place." "God forgive me. I was in line at the highway place, and 2 women were talking, and one of them said you were closing. And I stood in that parking lot, and I did a piece of math I should have done 9 years ago." He reached into his coat and pulled out a checkbook, and his hand was shaking. "You want to know what I figured? I figured I never paid you back. You told me I'd pay it forward when I was back on my feet, and not 1 day before. And then I got back on my feet, and I got busy being back on my feet, and I forgot. I let myself forget that a woman I barely knew fed my family for 8 months when I couldn't. That you taught my daughter to smile again over a bowl of frosting. Katie's a nurse now, Olivia. A pediatric nurse. She takes care of sick kids. And she learned she could stand to be around people again in the back of your shop." Olivia was gripping the doorframe. Ethan stood behind her, watching a piece of her past he'd never known existed walk right up onto her porch. "Frank, I never wanted you to pay me back, I told you." "I know what you told me." Frank's voice cracked wide open. "And that's exactly why I'm standing here, because you never once in 9 years called to collect. Not once. And I'll tell you what, Olivia. I have watched a lot of people in this life keep very careful track of every dime they were owed, and you're the only person I've ever met who did the opposite." He held up the checkbook. "So I'm not paying you back. You can't pay back what you did. But I am not going to stand here and let that bakery close. Not the bakery where my daughter learned to smile. Whatever you need, whatever the number is, you say it and it's done." For a moment, nobody in the doorway could speak. And then Olivia Brooks did something that Ethan Carter would remember for the rest of his life. She didn't reach for the checkbook. She stepped forward and she wrapped her arms around this enormous man in his expensive coat and Frank Delaney 3-car dealerships and a corner office, and all put his face down on the shoulder of a woman half his size and wept like the world had finally made sense of something. "You already paid me back," Olivia said into his coat, her own voice breaking. "Katie's a nurse, Frank. Katie takes care of sick kids. You paid me back the day she smiled again. I didn't need the money. I never needed the money." "I know you didn't," Frank said. "That's why you're getting it." Ethan stood back in the hallway with a crumpled sticky note still in his fist, watching, and he understood something then that reorganized his whole understanding of the woman he'd sprayed with a garden hose 6 weeks ago. He'd thought he was the one who saw her. He'd thought he was the only one who looked at Olivia Brooks and saw past the thing the world stopped at. He'd been proud of it a little in the private way you're proud of loving someone the world undervalues. And he'd been wrong. He wasn't the only one who saw her at all. There was a whole town full of people who saw her. They'd just been busy. They'd just forgotten to say it out loud. And Frank Delaney, standing in that doorway with a checkbook and a wet face, was only the first one to remember. When Frank finally pulled himself together and stepped back, he wiped his eyes with a handkerchief he actually carried in his pocket, an old man's habit, and he looked past Olivia for the first time and noticed Ethan standing in the hall. "Frank Delaney," he said, sticking out a hand still slightly damp. "Ethan Carter, I live next door." Frank looked at him. Then he looked at Olivia. Then he looked back at Ethan, and something shrewd and knowing came into the old car salesman's face, the look of a man who'd spent 40 years reading people across a desk. "Next door," Frank repeated. "Next door," Ethan said. "Uh-huh." Frank almost smiled. "And you let this woman get to 2 months from closing before anybody did anything about it." "I didn't know," Ethan said. "She doesn't exactly advertise when she's drowning." "No," Frank said, looking at Olivia with enormous tenderness. No, she never did. He tucked his checkbook away and clapped his hands together once, and just like that, the weeping man was gone, and a businessman stood in his place. All right, here's what's going to happen. Olivia, I want to see your books, all of them. Not because I don't trust you, because I've saved 3 businesses that were bleeding out, and I know where the wounds usually are. And you? He pointed at Ethan. You've got a look on your face like a man carrying something heavy. I don't know what it is, and it's none of my business. But I've been where you are, son, whatever it is. And I'll tell you what I learned. You can't carry the heavy stuff alone. You just can't. The ones who try are the ones who go under. Ethan opened his mouth to deflect it, the way he deflected everything, and then he caught Olivia looking at him, and he closed it again. It's a custody thing, he heard himself say, out loud, to a man he'd met 90 seconds ago. My ex wants to take my daughter. Says I can't give her a good enough life out here on my own. The words felt like pulling a splinter. It hurt going, and it felt better once it was out. Frank Delaney went very still. And then he said quietly, How old's your girl? 8. And you moved out here to give her a fresh start? Yeah. And you fix things for this whole neighborhood for free from what I'm gathering, and you work 60 hours a week, and you're sitting up nights scared to death. Somebody's going to tell you you're not enough. Frank nodded slowly. Son, I raised a daughter alone after I lost my wife. Alone, grieving, broke. And you know what made me enough? Not money, not a wife, not a perfect house. It was that I showed up. Every single day I showed up, even when I was falling apart. And that little girl grew up knowing that whatever else went wrong in the world, her daddy showed up. He put a heavy hand on Ethan's shoulder. You show up. Every day, Ethan said, and his voice broke on it. Then you're enough, Frank said simply. And if it comes to a fight, you find yourself some people. That's the whole secret right there. When they come for what's yours, you don't stand alone. You find your people, and you stand together. He looked at Olivia and back at Ethan, and this time he did smile. Looks to me like you might already have a start on that. And in the space of one afternoon, everything changed. The realtor's number was crumpled in Ethan's fist. Frank Delaney was in Olivia's kitchen with a pot of coffee and 11 years of financial records spread across the table, muttering to himself and circling things. Emma's crayon drawing was in the pocket over Olivia's heart. And Olivia Brooks, who had woken up that morning fully intending to run, stood in her own front hall and felt the ground shift under her feet. Not the terrifying shift of everything falling apart, but a different one, stranger and harder to trust. The shift of being caught. Of reaching for the door and finding for the first time in her whole life, hands reaching back. She looked at Ethan. He was still holding the crumpled sticky note, watching her, waiting, not pushing, just there. The way he'd been there in her kitchen when she was crying over the calculator, the way he'd been there through a fence for 6 weeks. And Olivia thought about the thing she'd said, I don't know how to stay. And she thought about the fact that she hadn't run. Not this morning when Emma knocked. Not this afternoon when Frank came. She was still here. Maybe that was how you learned. Maybe you didn't figure out how to stay all at once. Maybe you just didn't run today, and then didn't run tomorrow. Ethan, she said quietly, while Frank clattered around in the kitchen behind them. That thing you said, in there, about being enough only at my kitchen table. I meant it, Ethan said. I'm not taking it back. I know. She looked down at her hands. I'm not asking you to take it back. I'm asking you to... She stopped, gathered herself, made herself say it. This woman who had never in 30 years asked anyone for anything. I'm asking you to be patient with me, because I want to stay. God help me, I want to stay so bad I don't know what to do with it. But I'm going to want to run. Probably a lot. Probably tomorrow. And I need you to know that when I want to run, it's not because of you. It's because staying is the scariest thing I've ever done, and I've never once had a good reason to learn how. Ethan reached out and very gently took her hand. Then we'll learn together, he said. You teach me how to be enough. I'll teach you how to stay. And in the meantime, he glanced toward the kitchen where Frank was now loudly demanding to know why she'd been undercharging for custom cakes for 11 years. Olivia, my God. In the meantime, it sounds like your books are about to get audited by a car salesman." And Olivia Brooks laughed. Really laughed the same laugh she'd laughed soaking wet in her yard 6 weeks ago, the one that made Ethan feel like the sun had come out. She laughed until the tears came back, but they were different tears now, and both of them knew it. What neither of them knew was that Frank Delaney had already made 2 phone calls from the bathroom when he'd excused himself. One was to his daughter Katie, and the other was to a woman named Ruth Ann, who ran the Neighborhood Association newsletter, the one that went to every single house on 11 streets and who had been looking for weeks for a story worth telling. By that evening, without Olivia having any idea, the whole neighborhood knew that Brooks Family Bakery was in trouble. And the whole neighborhood was about to remember all at once, every loaf of bread and every free meal and every birthday she'd ever remembered, every single thing Olivia Brooks had ever quietly done for them, while believing the entire time that she was nobody's first choice. The armor she'd spent 30 years building to survive being invisible was about to fail her completely, because she was about to be seen. It started with the bread. 3 days after Frank Delaney wept in her doorway, Olivia unlocked the bakery at 5 in the morning like she always did, and there was a woman waiting on the step. An older woman, 70 at least, in a quilted coat, holding a covered dish. Olivia knew her Marjorie Payne, who lived over on Cedar, who'd been coming in for sourdough every Friday for 6 years and hadn't come in for 6 months because her arthritis made the walk hard. "Marjorie, honey, what are you doing out here at 5 in the morning?" "I heard," Marjorie said. Her chin was set in a way that dared Olivia to argue. "I heard you were closing, and I heard nobody knew, and I got so angry I couldn't sleep." "Do you remember what you did when Harold died?" Olivia went still. "Marjorie, you brought me bread," Marjorie said. "Every Friday for 2 months. You'd knock and you'd leave it, and half the time you wouldn't even come in because you knew I couldn't bear to talk to anybody. You just left the bread, so I'd know somebody remembered I was alive." Her voice was shaking now. "And I never said thank you. Not properly. Because I was too far down to say anything to anybody. So I'm saying it now. And I made you a casserole because I don't have Frank Delaney's money, but I have a casserole and 2 hands and a big mouth, and I have been on that telephone since Tuesday." Olivia's throat closed. "You've been on the telephone?" "I called everybody," Marjorie said with grim satisfaction. "Everybody, Olivia. And do you want to know what I found out? I found out. You've been quietly saving this whole neighborhood for 11 years, and not one of us ever said it out loud. Well, we're saying it now." By 7 that morning, there was a line out the door. Not the usual trickle. A line. People. Hadn't seen in months. People who'd drifted to the highway bakery, people who'd been embarrassed to keep coming when times got tight. They were all there, and they were buying, and more than a few of them were pressing bills into the tip jar that were far too big to be tips, and folding them so she couldn't see the number until they'd already gone. Olivia stood behind her own counter and watched it happen and could not speak. There was Danny Okafor, 22, now, who'd been a scrawny 15-year-old kid she'd caught trying to steal a muffin because his mother worked nights and there wasn't food in the house, and who she'd hired on the spot instead of calling the cops, and who she'd employed for 2 years until he got himself into community college. He was in line with a girlfriend on his arm. "Miss Olivia," he said, and he couldn't say anything else, and he didn't have to. There was the Guzman family, all 5 of them, who she'd sent home with the day's unsold bread every Saturday for years, during the stretch when Mr. Guzman lost his job at the plant. There was a young mother named Beth with a baby on her hip, who Olivia had let sit in the warm bakery for whole afternoons 2 winters ago, because Beth's apartment had no heat, and she was too proud to say so, and Olivia had never once made it a charity, had always made it look like she just wanted the company. Every single one of them was in that line. And every single one of them, Olivia realized with a slowly rising sense of something that felt almost like panic, remembered. She'd thought they hadn't. That was the thing. That was the belief she'd built 30 years of armor around. She'd told herself all those years that she gave because giving was the only thing that made her matter. That people took the bread and forgot the woman that she was. The shop was the giving, and none of it was really her, because her wasn't the kind of thing people kept. And here was the whole neighborhood standing in a line out her door at 7 in the morning, proving her wrong with their own 2 feet. She had to go in the back. She stood in the little storeroom among the flour sacks with her hand pressed over her mouth, and she cried. And Danny found her there, and didn't say anything. Just handed her a paper towel, and stood with her until she could breathe, the way she'd once stood with him in that same room when he was 15 and terrified and ashamed. "You okay, Miss Olivia?" "No," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "No, Danny, I am not even a little bit okay." "Good," Danny said, "'cause we're just getting started." He wasn't exaggerating. While Olivia had been reeling behind her counter, Frank Delaney had been busy, and Frank Delaney busy was a force of nature. He'd spent 2 full days going through 11 years of her books at her kitchen table, and what he found made him alternately furious and heartbroken. She'd been undercharging for everything. Her custom cakes, the wedding cakes, the elaborate birthday cakes that took her 12 hours each, she'd been charging maybe a third of what they were worth, because she could never quite bring herself to believe that her own work had that kind of value. "You've been running a charity and calling it a business," Frank told her, jabbing a pen at a column of numbers. "No wonder the highway place hurt you. They didn't beat you on quality. Nobody could beat you on quality. They beat you because you were practically giving it away, and you can't out-cheap a corporation, Olivia. You never could, but you never had to." He leaned back. "You know what you've got that they will never have in 10,000 years. You've got a line out the door of people who love you. That's not a bakery. That's a congregation. And congregations don't shop by price." He raised her prices. Over her protests over her flat panic, he raised them, and then he did something Olivia never would have done in 100 years. He told the truth about it, right on a little sign in the window in Ruth Ann's newsletter. "Everywhere. Brooks Family Bakery is fighting to stay open. Prices have gone up because they had to. Thank you for 11 years and for helping us see 12. Olivia was sure it would drive people away. It did the opposite. It turned out that people would pay for honesty. It turned out that a whole neighborhood, given the chance to save something they loved, would line up around the block for the privilege of paying full price. But not everyone was lining up, and that was where the trouble came in. Because 8 days into what Ruth Ann's newsletter had started calling the bakery miracle, a man in a suit came into the shop who nobody recognized, and he ordered a coffee, and he sat in the corner, and he took photographs of the menu and the prices and the line. And when Olivia asked if she could help him with anything, he smiled a smile with no warmth in it at all and said, "Just doing some market research," and left. 2 days after that, the landlord called. Olivia took the call in the back, and Ethan happened to be there. He'd taken to coming by on his lunch break, ostensibly to check on the finicky walk-in cooler. He'd been babying along actually to see her, and he watched her face change as she listened. Watched the color drain out of it, the way it had the day he'd found the realtor's number. "But we've made the back payments," she said into the phone. "Frank, Mr. Delaney worked it all out. We caught up everything. We're current." A pause. "I don't understand. If we're current, why would you—" A longer pause, and then very quietly, "Somebody made you an offer on the building." Ethan felt his stomach drop. Olivia hung up the phone slowly and stood there holding it against her chest, and when she looked up, her eyes were huge. "The Highway Bakery," she said. "The chain. They found out I was clawing my way back, and they made my landlord an offer to buy the whole building out from under me. Cash. Way over market. They don't even want the space. Ethan, they don't want a second location. My leasing agent as good as told me they want the corner. They want to shut me down so they don't have to compete with a line around the block. They can't beat me anymore, so they're just going to buy the ground I stand on." The bakery, which for 8 days had felt like a miracle, went silent around them. "Can they do that?" Ethan asked. "He owns the building. He can sell it to whoever he wants." Olivia set the phone down. "I've got 30 days on my lease. He's giving me the courtesy of the 30 days. After that, if the sale goes through—" She didn't finish. She didn't have to. And Ethan watched with a sick and helpless feeling as the old look started to come back into Olivia's face. The going places face. The one Emma had named. The one that meant Olivia Brooks was starting somewhere down deep to reach for the exit, because a lifetime had taught her that this was how it always went. that the miracle was never really hers to keep, that just when you let yourself hope, the ground got sold out from under you. "Hey," Ethan said sharply. "No, don't do that." "Do what?" "You've got that face." "I don't have a face." "You've got the face where you're already halfway gone. Where you're already telling yourself this proves you were right all along, that good things aren't for you, that you should have run when you had the chance." He crossed the little storeroom and took her by the shoulders. "Olivia, look at me. 8 days ago you had 2 months and no hope and a realtor's number on your fridge. Now you've got a line around the block and Frank Delaney fixing your books and a whole neighborhood that remembered all at once that they love you. That's not nothing. That happened. And you are not allowed to let one phone call from a coward with a checkbook erase all of it. He owns the building, Ethan." "Then we find out who owns the building better," Ethan said, and even he wasn't sure what he meant. But Frank Delaney, when they called him 20 minutes later, knew exactly what it meant. "Buildings," Frank said. And Olivia could hear him smiling on the other end of the line, the slow, dangerous smile of a man who'd spent 40 years in negotiations. "Are for sale." That's the thing about buildings, Olivia. Everybody always thinks the building belongs to whoever's got their name on it today. But a building belongs to whoever's willing to fight hardest for it. Now, how much did they offer your landlord? She told him the number the leasing agent had let slip. Frank was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's a lot of money." "See?" Olivia started. "It's a lot of money," Frank repeated, "for a corporation to spend just to kill a bakery. Which tells me something very interesting, Olivia. It tells me they're scared of you." She could hear him standing up on the other end, could hear the energy come into his voice. "You don't spend that kind of cash to squash a business that's dying on its own. You spend that kind of cash to squash a business that's winning. They wouldn't be buying the ground out from under you if they thought they could beat you fair. So here's what we're going to do." And that was the moment Olivia would think about it for a long time afterward. That was the moment the story stopped being about her hanging on by her fingernails and started being about something else entirely. Because Frank Delaney went to the landlord. And Frank Delaney, who had done well for himself, who owned 3 dealerships, and had the kind of relationships a man builds over 40 years in a small county, made a counteroffer. Not alone. He'd made 2 phone calls before he did it, and by the time he sat down across the desk from Olivia's landlord, he wasn't a lone old man with a checkbook. How was the front man for a group of people who had, in the space of about a week, decided that Brooks Family Bakery was not going to close on their watch? There was Frank. There was a contractor named Big Mike Sowinski, whose whole crew ate lunch at the bakery every day, and who Olivia had once catered his mother's funeral reception for at cost. There was the Guzman family's oldest boy, Marco, who'd grown up on Olivia's Saturday bread and was now a lawyer in the city, and who volunteered to handle the paperwork for nothing. And there was Beth, the young mother with no heat 2 winters ago, who wasn't a young mother with no heat anymore, who'd finished her nursing degree and married well, and who wrote a check that made Olivia sit down hard when she found out about it later. They didn't just match the chain's offer. They beat it. And they beat it with a clause the corporation would never in a million years agree to one. Marco, the lawyer, wrote into the offer specifically because he knew it would matter to the landlord. An old man himself, who'd owned that building for 30 years, and who it turned out had a conscience that had been keeping him up at night ever since he made that phone call. The clause said the building could never be sold to a commercial chain. Ever. It had to stay a local business forever, written into the deed. The landlord took their offer. He took less money to keep the building local. And when Olivia went to thank him crying, he wouldn't quite meet her eye, and he said, "My wife used to buy your hot cross buns every Easter for 11 years, Olivia. She passed in the spring. I don't know what I was thinking, taking that call from those people. I think when you're grieving, you stop thinking straight. But I couldn't do it. I got your bread in my freezer right now. Last thing she bought before the hospital. I couldn't be the man who sold the ground out from under the woman who made my wife's last Easter bread." The whole neighborhood had risen up. Every single person Olivia Brooks had ever quietly helped over 11 years of believing she was invisible had turned around at the exact same moment and helped her back. And it broke something open in her that had been sealed shut for 30 years. She'd built her whole self on a single quiet load-bearing belief that she gave because giving was the only way someone like her could earn a place, that the giving was the rent she paid for being allowed to exist, and that the moment she stopped being useful, she'd be forgotten. It was the belief underneath the armor. It was the reason she'd reached for the realtor's number. It was the reason she'd told Ethan she was nobody's first choice. And it had just been proven publicly, completely humiliatingly, gloriously wrong. She hadn't been earning her place. She'd had a place, all along. She'd been loved the whole time, and been too frightened to see it, too certain of her own worthlessness, to let the evidence in. The neighborhood hadn't forgotten her the second she stopped baking their bread. They'd carried her in their hearts for years waiting. It turned out for the one chance to carry her back. Olivia sat in her bakery the night the building deal closed after everyone had gone home in the dark with a single light on over the counter, and she took Emma's crayon drawing out of the pocket over her heart, where she'd been keeping it for 2 weeks, and she looked at it. "My family. Please stay, Miss Olivia. We picked you." "We picked you," she said out loud to the empty shop. And for the first time in her entire life, she let herself believe it might be true. But even as the bakery was being saved, the other storm was gathering. Because Ethan's fight was not going the way Olivia's had, and it was about to get much, much worse. The custody hearing had a date now, 6 weeks out. And Ethan's ex-wife had a lawyer who was very good and very expensive, and she had a new husband with a big house in a good school district and a household income that made Ethan's look like a rounding error, and she had a simple, devastating argument that she was going to make in front of a judge that a little girl belonged with 2 parents in a stable home, not with a single father, working 60-hour weeks in a house he was still fixing up in a state where he knew no one. In a state where he knew no one. That was the phrase that kept Ethan up at night. Because it had been true when he moved here. He'd chosen it, even the not knowing anyone, the anonymity, the clean slate. He'd thought it was safety. And now it was the thing that might cost him his daughter. Because a man alone with no roots, no community, no one to vouch for him, looks like a risk to a judge. Looks unstable. Looks like exactly the kind of home a good mother might worry about. He didn't tell Olivia how bad it was. Old habits. He'd let her see the shape of it that day in her kitchen. But he'd kept the worst of it in his own hands, the way he kept everything. And Olivia, still learning how to stay still, fighting her own war, hadn't pushed. Until Emma pushed for both of them. It was a Sunday night, the bad night. The night before, Emma's every other weekend switched back, and Ethan was tucking her in, and Emma looked up at him with those eyes that saw everything and said, "Am I going to have to live with Mom?" Ethan's whole body went cold. "Where did you hear that? I heard you on the phone. You said, 'She can't take her.' You were talking about me." Emma's lip was trembling now, the brave front cracking. "I don't want to go live with Mom in the city, Daddy. I want to stay here. I want to stay with you and Miss Olivia and go to my school and pet the bakery cat. Please don't make me go." And Ethan Carter, who had held it together through the divorce and the move and the lawyer and every sleepless night, felt the whole thing finally break right there on the edge of his daughter's bed. He gathered her up and held her while she cried, and he made her every promise he could, and inside he was screaming, because he did not actually know if he could keep a single one of them, and lying to your child about whether you can keep her is the loneliest thing in the entire world. He didn't hear the back door. He didn't hear Olivia, who'd come over with a plate of cookies for Emma, who'd learned Ethan's spare key was under the frog by the step, come quietly up the stairs when she heard the crying. He didn't know she was standing in the hallway in the dark, listening to a little girl beg her father not to send her away. He found out when he came out of Emma's room, finally after she'd cried herself to sleep, and found Olivia sitting on the top step with the plate of cookies in her lap and tears streaming silently down her face. "How much did you hear?" he said. "All of it." She wiped her face. "Ethan, how bad is it? And don't do the thing. Don't tell me it's fine. I heard your little girl beg you. It is not fine. How bad is it really?" And Ethan Carter, standing in the dark hallway of the house he'd bought to save his daughter, finally stopped keeping the map to himself. He sat down next to her on the step, and he told her all of it. The lawyer, the new husband, the big house, the income, the phrase that haunted him, a state where he knows no one, the very real, very close possibility that in 6 weeks a judge could decide that his daughter was better off 200 miles away, and that there was nothing legally that he could point to that would prove otherwise, because everything the court would weigh his ex-wife had more of. Money, stability, a second parent in the home. On paper, she won. On paper, he'd already lost. On paper, Olivia said quietly when he was done. On paper. You keep saying that. On paper, on paper. She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Ethan, 2 weeks ago on paper, I was a failed bakery, 2 months from closing, drowning in debt with no way out. On paper, I was done. She took his hand. And then a whole neighborhood I thought had forgotten I existed stood up and reminded me that paper isn't the whole story, that there's a whole other ledger nobody writes down, the one where you count up every casserole and every free loaf and every kid you didn't call the cops on. And when they added up that ledger, Ethan, the real one, I wasn't drowning at all. I was rich. I just couldn't see it because I was only looking at the paper. Ethan looked at her. You've got a ledger too, Olivia said. You just can't see it either, because you've spent your whole life being told to look at the paper. The income, the house, the single dad alone. But there's another ledger on you, Ethan Carter, and I have been watching it fill up for 2 months. You fix the whole neighborhood stuff for free. You show up. Every single day you show up for that little girl even when you're falling apart. And you moved 1,000 miles to a strange town so she could have a yard and a school and a chance. Her voice caught. You think you know no one in this town, but this town knows you. And there is a difference between a man who's alone and a man who just hasn't asked for help yet. Olivia. I asked for help, she said. For the first time in my whole life, I let people help me because you made me. You crumpled up my realtor's number in your own hand, and you told me you'd teach me how to stay. Well. She squeezed his hand hard. Now it's my turn. You are going to let me help you. You are going to let this whole neighborhood help you. Because you're not fighting alone anymore, Ethan. You just haven't figured out yet that you've got an army. Ethan stared at her, and something moved in his chest that he hadn't felt in a very long time, maybe ever. It wasn't hope exactly. It was bigger and quieter than hope. It was the feeling of a man who'd been carrying something impossibly heavy for so long that he'd forgotten it was heavy, and who felt for the first time another set of hands come under the weight. I don't know how to let people help me, he admitted. It was the same thing she'd said to him 2 weeks ago in her kitchen. I don't know how to stay. And they both heard the echo of it, and something passed between them in the dark hallway that was deeper than anything either of them had let themselves feel yet. I know you don't, Olivia said softly. So I'll teach you. The same way you taught me. She almost smiled. We're a mess, aren't we? The two of us. Complete disaster. Ethan agreed, and his voice was thick. Emma picked us anyway. Emma's got good taste. And there on the top step of a half-unpacked house with a sleeping 8-year-old on one side of the wall and a plate of forgotten cookies between them. Ethan Carter and Olivia Brooks stopped being two people fighting two separate wars and became something else. Two people fighting the same one. Olivia was the one who said it out loud. Finally, the thing that had been building for 2 months, though she said it sideways, the way people say the biggest things. When I thought about running, she said, staring at the cookies, not at him. The thing that scared me most wasn't losing the bakery. It was you. It was that I'd started... She stopped, made herself go on. It was that I'd started thinking of your kitchen table as mine. Your kid as... She couldn't finish that one. That's why I got the realtor's number, Ethan. Not because I didn't want it. Because I wanted it so bad it terrified me, and I've never once in my life gotten to keep the thing I wanted. Ethan turned toward her in the dark. You want to keep it? He said quietly. Then keep it. It's not going anywhere. I'm not going anywhere. The table's yours, Olivia. It's been yours since the first plate of cinnamon rolls. And the kid picked you in crayon, so that's legally binding. Olivia laughed, wet and broken and real. And me, Ethan said, and his voice was steadier than he felt. For whatever it's worth, in case that part wasn't clear. Me too. If you want to keep me, I'm right here. I'm not the realtor's number kind. I'm the stay kind. I just needed to find somebody worth staying for. The house was very quiet. Olivia reached over and took his hand again, and this time she didn't let go, And the two of them sat on that step for a long time, not needing to say anything else, while the fight that was coming gathered itself in the dark outside 6 weeks away and closing. Because there was still a hearing. There was still a very good lawyer, and a very big house, and a judge who would look at the paper. And Ethan Carter still had to walk into a courtroom and prove that a man alone in a house he was still fixing up was enough to keep his own child. But he wasn't alone anymore. He had a woman who'd just learned the hard way exactly how much a neighborhood could do when it decided to stand up for one of its own. He had a car salesman named Frank who'd already saved one impossible thing that month and had the taste of it in his mouth. He had a lawyer named Marco who owed his childhood to a bakery. And he had an entire town full of people who'd just been reminded what they were capable of when they stopped waiting and started showing up. Olivia squeezed his hand in the dark. 6 weeks, she said. Ethan, you have no idea what this neighborhood can do in 6 weeks. I didn't either. And then they did it for me. 6 weeks turned out to be exactly enough time for Ethan Carter to learn the lesson. Olivia had already learned that asking for help is the hardest thing a proud person ever does, and the one thing that saves them. It started small, the way it had for Olivia. It started with Frank Delaney showing up at Ethan's door on a Tuesday night with a legal pad and 2 cups of coffee from a gas station and no invitation whatsoever. Marco tells me you're not returning his calls, Frank said, walking past Ethan into the half-unpacked living room like he owned it. I don't want to bother him. He did Olivia's building for free. I'm not going to. Sit down, Frank said. Ethan sat down. Now you listen to me, son, because I'm only going to say this once, and then we're going to get to work. Frank set the coffees on a moving box that was still serving as a coffee table. You've got a certain kind of pride. I recognize it because I had it too after my wife passed. The kind where you'd rather go down swinging alone than let anybody see you need a hand. And I'm here to tell you that kind of pride is a luxury you cannot afford right now. Because it's not just you on the line. It's a little girl. And when it's the child on the line, a good man puts his pride in a drawer and he shuts the drawer. You understand me? Ethan looked at the gas station coffee going cold on the moving box. He thought about Emma begging him not to send her away. Yeah, he said. I understand you. Good. Then here's what Marco needs from you. And that was how it began. Marco Guzman, the lawyer who'd grown up on Olivia's Saturday bread, came over the next night and sat at Ethan's kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and started asking questions. And the questions were not about income or square footage, or any of the things Ethan had been lying awake terrified about. The questions were about Emma. When's the last time you missed one of her doctor's appointments? I don't miss them. None of them. None of them. I leave work. My boss docks me, but I go. Marco wrote that down. Who does her hair in this morning? I do. Ethan almost smiled, thinking of what Olivia had said. Badly. But I do it. Parent-teacher conferences. Both of them this year. Her mom made one. Marco's pen stopped. He looked up. Say that again. Her mom made one conference this year. I made both. Marco wrote it down and underlined it, and Ethan watched him underline it, and for the first time, a small, strange spark of something lit in his chest. Because he'd spent 6 months looking at the ledger of everything he lacked, and here was a lawyer writing down the other ledger, the one Olivia had told him about, the invisible one, and it was longer than Ethan had ever let himself believe. Here's what people get wrong about custody, Marco said, sitting back. They think it's about who has more money, more house, more parents in the home. And sometimes it goes that way, sure. But a good judge isn't weighing bank accounts. A good judge is trying to answer one question: where is this child most loved, most stable, and most cared for day to day in the small things? And the small things, Ethan, are your whole case. The hair, the appointments, the conferences, the onions. He glanced up. Olivia told me about the onions. The onions. How you learned Emma doesn't like onions. That's not nothing. That's a father who pays attention. You can't fake that on a witness stand. And their side can't manufacture it no matter how big the house is. Ethan sat very still. You think we can win? I think, Marco said carefully, that you've been fighting this whole thing as if you'd already lost. And you haven't. Not even close. But I need you to stop hiding Ethan. I need you to let people speak for you. And that's the part I think is going to be hardest for you, because from everything Olivia and Frank tell me, you'd rather chew glass than ask a neighbor for a favor. He wasn't wrong. And over the next weeks, chewing glass was more or less what it felt like, because Marco's strategy was character witnesses. People who could stand up in front of a judge and testify to the kind of father Ethan was, the kind of home he'd built, the kind of man he was in a community that supposedly didn't know him. And the terrible, humbling, wonderful truth that emerged over those weeks was that the community did know him. Ethan just hadn't noticed because he'd been too busy keeping everyone at arm's length to see how far his own quiet decency had traveled. There was Mrs. Petrakis, 3 doors down, whose furnace Ethan had fixed at 11 o'clock on a January night for the cost of the part. No labor because she was 80, and it was 14 degrees, and he wasn't going to let an old woman freeze while he wrote up an invoice. "You fixed my furnace," she said when Marco called her, "and you wouldn't take a dime for your trouble, and then you came back the next day to make sure it was still running right, and you brought that sweet little girl of yours, and she drew me a picture. I have it on my refrigerator." Of course I'll speak for him. What kind of question is that? There was the school. Emma's teacher, Ms. Abernathy, who told Marco that Ethan was one of maybe 3 fathers in the whole class who showed up engaged on time, prepared, who knew what his daughter was reading and struggling with and proud of, who'd once stayed 45 minutes after pickup to help her move classroom furniture because he saw her struggling and couldn't walk past it. There was Big Mike Sawinski, the contractor, who Ethan had helped out of a jam on a job, once staying up half a night to fix a client's busted pipe, so Mike's crew wouldn't lose the contract, and who now said to anyone who'd listen that Ethan Carter was the most reliable man he'd ever met, and he'd stake his own reputation on it. One by one they came forward. And one by one, Ethan had to sit across from each of them and say out loud the words he'd spent his whole life avoiding. "I need help. My daughter's on the line, and I need your help." And every single time it cost him something to say it, and every single time what came back was so immediate and so warm and so total that he'd have to go sit in his truck afterward and put his head against the wheel, because he'd spent 35 years believing that asking for help was the same as admitting you were nothing, and it turned out it was the exact opposite. It turned out that letting people help you was how you found out they'd loved you all along. Just like Olivia, she was the one who held him together through it. On the nights when it got to be too much, when the hearing felt too close, and the outcome too uncertain, and the old voice came back whispering, "You're going to lose her. You're not enough. You never were." Olivia was there. She'd learned over the past weeks exactly how to be there, because it was the thing she'd been doing for other people her whole life. And now, for the first time, she got to do it for someone who was doing it right back. "You know what I keep thinking about?" she said one night, the two of them at his kitchen table after Emma was asleep, the legal pads and witness lists spread out between them. "I keep thinking about how you found the realtor's number on my fridge, and you crumpled it up, and you told me you'd teach me how to stay. And I thought you were being kind. I didn't know you meant it as a trade." She reached across the table and took his hand. "You taught me how to stay. Now I'm teaching you how to let people hold you up. We're just handing the same thing back and forth, you and me. Neither of us could do it alone. But together we—" She stopped and her eyes filled. "Together we're kind of unstoppable, aren't we?" Ethan turned her hand over in his. "Marry me," he said. It came out of nowhere. It came out of the middle of a conversation about custody hearings and witness lists at a kitchen table covered in legal pads from a man who had sworn to himself 8 months ago that he would never, ever do this again. And it landed in the room like the sprinkler had landed on Olivia 2 months before, out of nowhere all at once, changing everything. Olivia went completely still. "Ethan, I mean it. I know the timing is insane. I know we're in the middle of the worst thing that's ever happened to either of us. But that's exactly why I'm saying it now, Olivia, because I've spent this whole thing thinking about what makes a home stable, what makes a family real, what a judge sees when he looks at us, and I finally figured it out. It's not the house. It's not the money. It's not 2 parents on paper. It's love. It's who shows up. And you show up. You show up harder than anyone I've ever known. Emma picked you in crayon, And I've been picking you every single day since you took a garden hose to the chest and made a joke so I'd feel better." His voice broke. "I'm not asking you to win a custody case. I want that clear. I'm asking you because I cannot imagine one single day of the rest of my life where you're not at this table. The case is just what finally made me brave enough to say it." Olivia was crying now, and laughing, and shaking her head. And Ethan's heart started to drop, until he realized she wasn't shaking her head no. "You absolute idiot," she said. "You beautiful, broken, stubborn idiot. Do you have any idea?" She pressed her hand to her mouth. "Do you have any idea how long I have loved you since the cinnamon rolls, Ethan? Since you got on your knees in my wet grass to pick up my soggy boxes because it was the decent thing to do. I have loved you since the first week, and I was going to leave rather than let myself have it, and you—" She wiped her face. "Yes, yes, yes, of course it's yes. It was always going to be yes. It's been yes for 2 months. I was just too scared to—" Ethan was around the table before she finished, and he kissed her, and two people who had each in their own way spent their whole lives certain they'd never be someone's first choice, chose each other all the way. No realtor's number. No going places face, no armor left at all. They didn't tell Emma right away. They wanted one perfect night to be sure of it themselves first. But Emma, who noticed everything, noticed. She came down for a glass of water and found the two of them at the kitchen table holding hands and looking at each other like that. And she stood in the doorway in her pajamas and said with the flat certainty of an 8-year-old who has been waiting a long time for the adults to catch up, "Are you two getting married or what?" And Ethan and Olivia looked at each other, and Ethan said, "Yeah, Bug, we are, if that's okay with you." Emma considered this with tremendous seriousness. Then she said, "Finally," and climbed into Olivia's lap and put her arms around her neck, and the three of them sat like that in the kitchen at 11 o'clock at night, and it was Ethan thought the first time since the divorce that his house had felt completely, entirely full. But the hearing was still coming. And the other side wasn't sitting still either, because 11 days before the court date, Ethan's ex-wife found out he was engaged, and she did not take it the way anyone hoped. Marco got the call first, her lawyer arguing that this hasty engagement to a woman Ethan had known for barely 2 months, a woman with a failing bakery and a history of financial trouble. They'd done their homework was itself evidence of instability. That Ethan was so desperate to win the case that he'd manufactured a fake family overnight. That the whole thing reeked of a man scrambling to look respectable for a judge, and that it should count against him, not for him. Ethan read the filing and felt the ground open up under him all over again. "She's twisting it," he said, his hands shaking with the paper in them. "She's taking the best thing that's ever happened to me, and she's turning it into a weapon. She's going to stand up in that courtroom and tell a judge that Olivia is that our whole—" He couldn't finish. They looked into Olivia. They found the bakery trouble. They're going to make her sound like a gold digger or a mess or— "Ethan." Marco's voice was calm. "Ethan, look at me. This is what the other side does when they're losing. You understand? You don't attack the strongest part of your opponent's case unless the rest of your case is falling apart. She's going after the engagement because she's got nothing else. Because all those character witnesses scared her lawyer. This is desperation, not strength." But Olivia wasn't so sure. And that night, the old fear came back for her harder than it had come in weeks, because this was the thing she'd been most afraid of all along, at the very bottom of everything. Not losing the bakery. Not even losing Ethan. It was this being the reason someone she loved got hurt. Being the liability. Being the thing people pointed to and said, "See, that's the problem, that's the weak link." Her whole life she'd believed that she was at best something people put up with. And now here was a court document in black and white saying exactly that. Saying that she was the flaw in Ethan's case, the mess, the reason he might lose his own daughter. Ethan found her in her bakery at midnight in the dark, sitting at one of the little tables with her head in her hands. He knew the posture. He'd seen it the first time months ago over the calculator, and his heart clenched because he knew what it meant. "Don't," he said from the doorway. "Whatever you're thinking, don't. They're going to use me against you." She didn't lift her head. "Ethan, they're going to stand up in that courtroom and say that I'm the reason you're unfit. That you got engaged to a broke baker 2 months in because you were desperate. And the worst part, her voice cracked. The worst part is that they're not entirely wrong about how it looks. Look at the timing. Look at me. What if I cost you, Emma? What if the best thing I could do for you and that little girl is to disappear before the hearing, so their whole argument falls apart? So it's just you, the good father, standing on your own 2 feet, like you always were before I. Stop. Ethan crossed the bakery and pulled a chair around and sat down knee to knee with her and took both her hands and held them so she couldn't hide her face anymore. Stop. Right now. I know exactly what you're doing. You're reaching for the realtor's number. There isn't one this time, so you're inventing one. You're trying to leave to protect me, the same way you tried to leave to protect me before, and I am telling you the same thing I told you then. It doesn't work. It just makes everybody tired, and it makes everybody hurt worse, and it doesn't protect anybody. It just means you lose the thing before you can find out whether you got to keep it. But what if I cost you? Then I'd rather lose the case standing next to you, Ethan said, than win it standing alone. Olivia went silent. You hear me, I mean that. I have thought about it. I have lain awake and thought about the cold hard math of it, whether Marco's right, whether they can really use you against me. And I decided something. I decided that a version of my life where I win Emma back by hiding the woman I love in a closet, so a judge thinks I'm a sad, lonely man who's easier to sympathize with. That's not a life I want to win. That's not a home I want to give Emma. You know what home I want to give her, the real one, the messy one, the one where her dad married the woman who leaves the onions out of her soup and hangs her ugly drawings in the window like they're worth $1 million. If a judge can't see that that's better for a little girl than a big empty house with 2 people who tolerate each other, then... He stopped, jaw tight. Then that's a judge I can't do anything about anyway. But I'm not hiding you. I will never hide you. Do you understand me? You have spent your whole life being the thing people kept quiet about, the backup, the second choice, the one they were glad to have, but never proud to show off. Not with me. I want to stand up in that courtroom, and I want to point at you and say, that's my family. That's who we are. Look at us. Olivia was crying so hard she couldn't speak. So no, Ethan said gentler, now wiping her face with his thumbs. You don't get to disappear before the hearing. You don't get to protect me by leaving. You already promised me you'd learn how to stay, and Olivia... His own voice broke. This is the staying. Right here. This is the hard part of it. This is the part where staying costs something, and you do it anyway. This is what I've got to learn how to do too, with the witnesses, and the asking for help. Help. We're in the exact same fight. Don't you dare quit on it now. And Olivia Brooks, who had spent 30 years leaving before she could be left, looked at the man in front of her and made the bravest decision of her entire life. She stayed. Okay, she whispered. Okay, I'll stand next to you. Even if it costs us. I'll stand right there. Even if it costs us, Ethan said. Even if it costs us. And when Frank Delaney heard the next morning what the other side was trying to do, turn the engagement into a weapon. Turn Olivia into a liability. The old car salesman got very quiet, and then he got very still, and then he said something that made both of them look up. You know what? Frank said slowly. They just made a mistake. What do you mean? I mean, they just handed us the case. Frank's eyes had that dangerous shine again, the one from the day he'd stared down Olivia's landlord. Think about it. They want to argue that your engagement is proof you're unstable. Fine. Then we put every one of those character witnesses on the stand, and we let them talk about not just Ethan, but the 2 of you together. We let Mrs. Petrakis talk about the man who fixed her furnace, and the woman who fed half the block. We let Marco tell the judge his own childhood story about Olivia's bread. We turned their whole attack inside out. He leaned forward. They want to say you cobbled together a fake family to fool a court. We're going to show that judge the realest family in the whole county. And we're going to do it with a room full of people who showed up on their own for free because they love you. You cannot fake that, and you cannot beat it. And their lawyer is going to watch it happen and realize far too late that attacking the engagement was the worst decision he ever made. Ethan looked at Frank and then at Olivia, and something settled in his chest that hadn't settled in a very long time. "You really think it'll work, son?" Frank said. "I have watched this neighborhood pull off 2 miracles in 2 months. I watched a whole town save a bakery from a corporation. I watched a proud man learn to ask for help. I don't think anymore. I know. You want to know what beats money and a big house and a lawyer in an expensive suit?" He stood up and he put one hand on Ethan's shoulder and one hand on Olivia's. "People. People who show up. That's it. That's the whole secret. It was always the whole secret. Your ex-wife's got everything on paper, but you two have got something she will never ever be able to buy, and in 11 days we're going to walk it right through those courtroom doors and set it down in front of a judge." The hearing was 11 days away, and for the first time Ethan Carter wasn't afraid of it. Not because he was sure he'd win, nobody could be sure of that, but because he finally understood what Olivia had been trying to tell him on that step weeks ago in the dark with a plate of cookies between them. He wasn't walking in alone. He was walking in with a fiancé who'd learned how to stay, and a daughter who'd picked her family in crayon, and a car salesman who saved impossible things for sport, and a lawyer who owed his childhood to a loaf of bread, and an old woman with a furnace story, and a teacher, and a contractor, and a whole neighborhood full of people who'd been quietly loved by these two for years, and were finally all at once getting the chance to love them back. Olivia took his hand across the table, and Emma's crayon drawing sat between them, and Frank Delaney was already on the phone lining up witnesses, and outside the sun was coming up on a town that had decided house by house that this little family was worth fighting for. 11 days. The morning of the hearing, Emma couldn't find her shoes, and Ethan nearly came apart over it. It was such a small thing. A pair of little black dress shoes, the ones Olivia had bought her the week before, because Emma had insisted she wanted to look nice for the judge. And now it was 7:40, and they were due in court at 9, and the shoes were nowhere, and Ethan stood in the middle of his daughter's room, with his tie half knotted, and his hands shaking, and felt the whole enormous terror of the day come crashing down on him through the tiny crack of a missing pair of shoes. "They have to be somewhere," he said too loud. "Emma, where did you—" "Ethan!" Olivia's hand landed on his back. She'd let herself in at 6:30 with a bag of pastries nobody would eat, and a calm she'd been manufacturing all morning for exactly this. "Ethan, breathe. They're under her bed. They're always under the bed." She crouched down, and there they were, and she slid them onto Emma's feet one at a time, like the whole world wasn't about to be decided in 2 hours. "There. See, crisis averted. First crisis of the day, and it's not even 8. We're going to be fine." "You don't know that," Ethan said quietly so Emma couldn't hear. "No." Olivia agreed, just as quietly, standing up. "I don't. But I know we're going to walk in there together, and I know that whatever happens, that little girl is going to see her father fight for her with everything he's got, and Ethan." She straightened his tie, the one he'd been mangling. "That's a thing she gets to keep forever no matter what a judge decides. She gets to grow up knowing her daddy stood up. You already gave her that. They can't take that one." Ethan looked at her, and some of the shaking went out of his hands. "How are you this calm?" "I'm not," Olivia said. "I'm dying inside. But I've had a lot of practice looking calm while I'm dying inside. Might as well finally put it to good use." The courthouse steps at 8:50 in the morning were where the day stopped being about a missing pair of shoes and became something none of them would ever forget. Because they were not alone on those steps. Ethan came around the corner with Emma's hand in one of his and Olivia's hand in the other, and he stopped dead, and Olivia stopped beside him, and even Emma went quiet. They were all there. Frank Delaney, in a suit that cost more than Ethan's truck, standing at the front like a general. Marco Guzman, beside him with a briefcase and a look of quiet ferocity. Mrs. Petrakis, 80 years old, who had gotten her grandson to drive her, holding her purse in both hands. Big Mike Sowinski, and 3 of his crew, having taken the morning off work, wearing the only ties they owned. Ms. Abernathy, Emma's teacher, who'd arranged a substitute so she could be here. Marjorie Payne in her quilted coat. Danny Okafor in a shirt he'd clearly ironed himself. The Guzman family. Beth, the young mother who wasn't a young mother in trouble anymore. And behind them, more faces. Ethan half recognized neighbors. He'd fixed a fence for once, people. Olivia had fed a whole crowd of people standing on the courthouse steps at 8:50 in the morning on a workday, because a family they loved was in trouble. Ethan Carter stood at the bottom of the steps and could not move and could not speak. "I told you," Olivia whispered next to him, and she was crying and she wasn't wiping it away. "Ethan, I told you. You said you knew no one in this town. Look, look." Frank came down the steps toward them, and he put his hand on Ethan's shoulder, and he said in a voice roughened by more emotion than the old salesman usually let show, "Every one of these people asked to be here. I didn't have to twist a single arm. I put out the word, and this is what came back. So you walk into that courtroom with your head up, son. You are the least alone man in the state of Colorado this morning." And Emma, 8 years old, looked up at the crowd of grown-ups who'd come to fight for her family, and she said in the clear, carrying voice of a child who doesn't yet know you're supposed to whisper about big feelings, "Are all these people here for us?" "Yeah, Bug," Ethan managed. "They are. Because we're a family," Emma said. Not a question. A fact she was filing away, a thing she now knew about the world, a lesson opposite and equal to the one about the going places face. And Olivia had to turn away for a second, because it was too much, all of it. The whole impossible weight of being loved out loud after a lifetime of believing you never would be. Inside the courtroom was smaller and plainer than any of them expected, and it filled up in a way courtrooms usually don't. The gallery behind Ethan's table crowding with neighbors, while the other side of the aisle held only his ex-wife, her new husband, and her lawyer. 3 people in expensive clothes who turned around at the sound of the crowd and could not hide the flicker of alarm that crossed the lawyer's face when he saw how many people had come. Ethan's ex-wife caught his eye across the aisle. For one moment, something passed between them that wasn't anger, something older and sadder, the ghost of 2 people who'd once meant it. And then her lawyer leaned over and whispered something and her face closed, and the moment was gone. The judge was a woman in her 60s, named Judge Eleanor Hastings, with reading glasses low on her nose and 40 years of watching families come apart in front of her. And she had seen every trick, every performance, every manufactured tear. And she made that clear in the first 5 minutes in a dry voice that suggested she suffered no fools of any income bracket. The other side went first. And it was worse than Ethan had feared, and better both at once. Worse because his ex-wife's lawyer was good, was smooth. Laid it all out exactly as Marco had predicted. The 60-hour weeks, the single income, the half-finished house, the isolation, the sudden engagement to a woman with a documented history of financial distress, known to the court, barely 2 months. He painted Ethan without ever raising his voice as a well-meaning but overwhelmed man, clutching at a hasty marriage to look stable for exactly this hearing. He was careful. He was clinical. He never once said anything cruel, which somehow made it land harder. And when he sat down, the whole gallery of neighbors was silent, and Ethan felt the old voice rise up one last time. "You're not enough. You never were." Then Marco stood up. "Your Honor," he said. "Opposing counsel has painted a very tidy picture. A father who works too much. A house that isn't finished. An engagement that's too fast. And on paper," he let the word hang, and Ethan felt Olivia's breath catch beside him, because it was her word, the one she'd given him on the step in the dark. "On paper, it's a compelling case. But this court has never in your 40 years on the bench decided the fate of a child on paper. So I'm not going to argue paper with you. I'm going to do something much simpler. I'm going to let you meet the people who actually know this family. And then I'm going to ask you one question at the end, and I think you'll already know the answer." He called Mrs. Petrakis first. The old woman made her way to the stand, slowly refusing help, and she was sworn in, and Marco asked her to tell the court in her own words about the night her furnace broke. And Mrs. Petrakis told it the 14-degree January night, the 11 o'clock knock on Ethan's door, the man who came in his pajamas and worked 2 hours and wouldn't take a dime, and who came back the next day to be sure, and who brought his little girl who drew her a picture that was still on her refrigerator. "I'm 81 years old," Mrs. Petrakis said to the judge, "and I have had a great many neighbors in my life, and I will tell you that most of them are perfectly nice people who would let an old woman freeze rather than miss their television program. This man is not one of those people. This man got out of bed. And if you are sitting there wondering whether he's a good enough father to keep his own child, then I don't know what a good father is supposed to look like, because I have never in my life seen a better man, and I would trust that little girl to him over anyone I have ever known. The courtroom was very quiet. Marco called Ms. Abernathy. Emma's teacher told the court about the fathers who show up and the fathers who don't, and which kind Ethan was, and the 45 minutes he'd stayed to move furniture, and the fact that Emma Carter came to school steady and fed and loved, and known that her father knew what she was reading, and what scared her, and what she was proud of, which Ms. Abernathy said is rarer than this court might imagine. Marco called Big Mike, who was too big for the witness chair, and cried anyway. This enormous contractor, when he tried to talk about the night Ethan stayed up to save his crew's contract. And then Marco did the thing that Frank had promised would turn the whole case inside out. He called the witnesses to talk about Olivia, because the other side had made her the weakness. So Marco made her the proof. Marjorie Payne told the court about the bread after her husband died. The Fridays Olivia left it on the step, so she'd know somebody remembered she was alive. Danny Okafor, 22 years old, stood up in his ironed shirt and told a courtroom full of strangers about being 15 and hungry, and caught stealing a muffin, and about the woman who hired him instead of calling the police, and who employed him for 2 years, and who was the reason he was in community college and not somewhere much worse. He could barely get through it. And then Frank Delaney took the stand, and Frank told the whole thing. 9 years ago, his wife dying. The medical bills. His own daughter, 12 years old, so wrecked with grief she'd stopped eating. And a young baker he barely knew who noticed who left food on his porch for 8 months and wouldn't be paid. Who said you'll pay it forward when you're back on your feet, and not one day before, who taught his grieving daughter to decorate cookies on Saturday mornings, so she'd have a reason to leave the house. That little girl is a pediatric nurse now, Your Honor, Frank said, and his voice cracked in a silent courtroom. She takes care of sick children. And she learned she could stand to be around people again in the back of that woman's bakery. So when opposing counsel stands up and suggests that Olivia Brooks is some kind of liability, some kind of red flag, some fast mistake this man made to look good for a judge, I have to tell you respectfully that it's the single most wrong-headed thing I've heard in 62 years of living. That woman has been quietly holding this entire neighborhood together for 11 years, while believing the whole time that nobody noticed. We noticed. We're all here because we noticed. And any child would be lucky, Your Honor, to be raised in a home with a woman like that in it. Ethan looked over at Olivia, and she had both hands pressed over her mouth, and tears were streaming down her face. And 30 years of believing she was nobody's first choice were being dismantled in open court. One sworn testimony at a time by people who'd loved her the whole time, and were finally saying it where she had to hear it. And then Judge Hastings did something unusual. She took off her reading glasses, and she looked at the crowded gallery for a long moment, and then she looked at Emma, sitting in the front row between Frank and Marjorie in her little black dress shoes. I'd like to hear from the child, the judge said. If she's willing, not under oath. Just come here, sweetheart. I only want to ask you one thing. The whole room held its breath. Ethan started to rise protective, and Marco put a hand on his arm. Olivia gripped his other hand so hard it hurt. And Emma Carter slid off the bench and walked up the aisle in her little shoes, past all the grown-ups who'd come to fight for her, and stood in front of a judge who had decided the fate of 1,000 children, and had learned over 40 years that sometimes the smallest voice in the room is the only one telling the whole truth. You're not in any trouble, Judge Hastings said gently. I promise. I just want to ask you a question, and I want you to answer it however you really feel okay. There's no wrong answer. Emma nodded. Can you tell me, the judge said, what home feels like to you? Not which house, not who has a bigger yard. I want to know when you think about the word home, what do you think of? And Emma Carter, 8 years old, thought about it with the tremendous seriousness she brought to everything, and then she said in her clear, carrying voice, home is where somebody knows I don't like onions. A sound went through the courtroom, half a laugh, half a sob. My mom's house is nice. Emma went on, because she'd been asked to tell the whole truth, and she was a truthful child. It's big, and I have my own bathroom. But at my dad's house, Miss Olivia leaves the onions out of my soup because she noticed I don't like them. And my dad does my hair, even though he's bad at it, and he never misses my doctor. And when I was scared, I was going to have to leave, all these people came." She looked back at the crowded gallery at Mrs. Petrakis and Frank and Danny, and all of them, and then she looked back at the judge. "Nobody came like this for me before. So I think home is here. Home is where all the people came." Judge Hastings was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice had changed. "Thank you, Emma," she said. "You can go sit with your dad now." And Emma walked back down the aisle and climbed into Ethan's lap, and Ethan wrapped both arms around his daughter and pressed his face into her hair, and could not have spoken to save his life. The judge did not deliberate for weeks. She didn't need to. She called a 15-minute recess, and she came back, and she put her glasses back on, and she looked at both sides of the aisle, and she delivered her ruling in the plain, unhurried voice of a woman who had finally, after a long day, arrived at something she was sure of. She said that she had spent 40 years being asked to measure things that don't measure love and stability and what a child needs. She said that the law asks her to look at incomes and living arrangements and all the things that fit on paper, and that she did look at them, and that on those measures, the two households were more alike than opposing counsel had suggested, both of them homes where a child would be materially fine. "But I was not asked here today to decide where this child would be materially fine," Judge Hastings said. "I was asked to decide where she belongs. And I have been doing this a very long time, and I have learned to listen for one thing above all others, which is the sound of a child who is known, not provided for, known, seen, understood in the small and specific ways that cannot be faked and cannot be bought and do not show up anywhere on paper." She looked at Ethan. "Mr. Carter, in 11 years on this bench, I have rarely seen a case where that was so clear. Your daughter told me that home is where somebody knows she doesn't like onions. I have heard a great many definitions of home in this courtroom. That is the best one I have ever heard. And it is entirely to your credit, and to the credit of the woman you are marrying, and to the credit of every single person who filled this gallery today, most of whom I gather took a day's wages to be here." She granted primary custody to Ethan. The room did not erupt. It was too full for that, too heavy, too much had been held too long. Instead, there was a sound like the whole gallery exhaling at once, and then Mrs. Petrakis started to cry, and then Big Mike, and then it moved through the crowd like a wave. And Olivia turned and buried her face in Ethan's shoulder over the top of Emma's head, and the three of them held on to each other in the front row of a courtroom, while behind them a whole neighborhood wept with joy for a family that was by every measure that mattered, and none that fit on paper, finally permanently safe. Ethan looked across the aisle one time. His ex-wife was crying too, but it wasn't only anger, and when she caught his eye, she gave the smallest nod. Not defeat exactly. Something more like the letting go of a fight she'd known somewhere underneath she'd been having with herself more than with him. Emma would still have summers with her mother. She would still be loved from two directions. But she would grow up in the house where somebody knew about the onions, and everyone in that room, including the woman across the aisle, understood at last that this was right. They were married in the spring in the bakery, not a church. The bakery. Because where else would it be? Frank Delaney gave Olivia away, walking her the short distance between the flour-dusted counter and the little cleared space by the window where Emma's drawing had hung for months, and he wept the entire way and didn't care who saw. Marco stood up as Ethan's best man. Mrs. Petrakis sat in the front row in a hat. Danny Okafor made the cake, having learned from the best, and when he set it down, he told Olivia it was the first thing he'd ever made that he thought was good enough for her, and she cried so hard she nearly couldn't say her vows. Emma was the flower girl, and she took the job with tremendous seriousness, and halfway down the aisle she stopped and turned to the crowd of neighbors, packed into the little bakery, and announced, "This is my family." The way she'd said it on the courthouse steps, filing it away permanently into the record of the world. And Olivia Brooks, who had spent 30 years, certain she would always be someone's second choice, the backup, the good friend, the woman people were grateful for, but never proud of Olivia. Brooks stood in the bakery she'd nearly lost in front of a whole town that had risen up to save her, and married a man who had looked at her soaking wet with a garden hose and seen immediately and forever the most valuable thing in the room. She was nobody's second choice. She never had been. She'd just needed a broken sprinkler and a little girl in crayon and a whole neighborhood full of people to finally show her the truth. A year later, the sprinkler was still in the yard. Ethan had never fixed it. Not because he couldn't, he was a repair technician. It would have taken him 10 minutes, but because neither of them would let him. It had become a thing between them, that broken sprinkler. A private monument in the corner of a garden that now belonged to both houses because they'd taken down the fence the summer after the wedding and made the 2 yards one. Every so often on a warm evening, Olivia would look at it and say, "You know you still haven't fixed that thing. Some repairman you are." And Ethan would say, "Are you still using that against me?" After all this time? "Honey, I'm going to use it against you for the rest of my life. You soaked me in front of God and everybody on day one." That's a lifetime of leverage right there. It worked, didn't it? And she'd laugh that same laugh. The one from the very first morning. The one that had made a broken man remember what his own laugh sounded like. "Yeah," she'd say softer. "Yeah, it worked." They turned the bakery into something more than a bakery. With Frank's help and the neighborhood's momentum, they started a program out of the back of the shop for single parents who were drowning. The way Ethan had been drowning for families going under the way. Frank's family had gone under 9 years before, for people who'd learned the same lie Olivia had learned, that they were alone, that nobody would come, that they had to carry it all themselves. The bakery became the place where the neighborhood proved otherwise over and over, one struggling family at a time. Beth ran the volunteer schedule. Danny taught teenagers to bake. Marjorie Payne, well into her 80s, now sat by the window and remembered everybody's birthday, having appointed herself, she said, to the position Olivia had held for 11 years, because somebody had to, and she'd learned from a master. Olivia became, without ever meaning to, something like a legend among the women of that town. Women who'd spent their lives being judged for their bodies, being told what they were and weren't good enough for being certain they were. Nobody's first choice. They came to her bakery, and they met a woman who had believed all of that too, every word of it, for 30 years, and who had been proven wrong in the most public and undeniable way imaginable. And they'd watch her behind her counter, married and radiant and sure of herself at last. And something in them would loosen the way. Something had loosened in Ethan the first morning, and they'd understand, some of them for the first time, that their worth had never once been a number on a scale or a size on a tag. That confidence was never about the body you lived in. It was about knowing all the way down that you deserved kindness and respect and love, and that you didn't have to earn your place in the world by being useful because you'd had a place the whole time and just been too frightened to see the people who'd saved you a seat. Ethan changed too. The man who'd moved to Colorado specifically so that no one would know him became a man who knew everyone, who could not walk down his own street without stopping 4 times, who had somehow become, without ever planning it, one of the load-bearing walls of an entire community. He stopped being the failed husband in his own head. He'd walk into his full, loud, onion-conscious house at the end of a long day, and Emma would be doing homework at the kitchen table. Olivia had once called hers, and Olivia would be pulling something warm out of the oven, and the old voice that used to whisper, "You're not enough," had simply stopped whispering because there was no room left for it anymore. There was no room in a life that full. On the first anniversary of the wedding, they stood together in the garden in the evening, the 3 of them with the broken sprinkler in the corner catching the last of the light. And Emma, 9 now taller, asked the question. Children ask when they're old enough to want the story straight. "Is it true, Miss Olivia?" She still called her that, sometimes out of habit and love. "Is it true you sprayed her with the hose on the very first day?" "Dead center," Ethan said. "Right in the face. Worst first impression in the history of the world." "And she wasn't even mad. She made a joke so I'd feel better," Ethan said, and he looked at his wife over the top of their daughter's head. That's when I knew. I didn't know that I knew. But that was the moment. Some stranger sprayed her with a fire hose, and her first thought was making sure he was okay. You don't meet that twice in a life bug. You meet it once if you're lucky, and then you don't ever let it go. Olivia reached over and took his hand, the way she had on the step in the dark, the way she had at the kitchen table covered in legal pads, the way she had in the front row of a courtroom. You almost let me go, she reminded him softly. I had a realtor's number on my fridge. And I crumpled it up, Ethan said. And I told you I'd teach you how to stay. You did. She leaned her head against his shoulder. You taught me how to stay. And I taught you how to let people hold you up. We just kept handing the same thing back and forth until neither one of us was drowning anymore. Emma looked at the two of them, and then at the sprinkler, and with the tremendous seriousness she had never lost, she delivered the moral of the whole story, the way only a child can, unadorned and dead accurate. So the best thing that ever happened, she said, was an accident. And Olivia Brooks. Olivia Carter now laughed and pulled the little girl who had picked her in crayon into her arms, and looked at the man who had sprayed her with a garden hose on the worst and best morning of both their lives, and she said the truest thing she had ever said. The thing it had taken her 30 years and a broken sprinkler and a whole neighborhood to finally completely believe. No, baby, she said. The accident was just how they found me. Getting picked was never the accident. That part was always going to happen. I just had to stop running long enough to let it. The fence was gone. The 2 yards were won. The bakery downtown was full of light and people and the smell of bread, and it would be full tomorrow and the day after and for all the years still coming. A little girl grew up knowing exactly what home meant. A broken man learned he was enough. And a woman who spent her whole life certain she'd never be someone's first choice stood in a garden with her family in the fading light and knew at last and forever that she had been chosen all along. She had only ever needed to stay.